The morning sun peeked through the blinds as Amy woke up to the familiar sound of her alarm. Another day of responsibility awaited her. At 32, her life looked different than she had planned. 3 years ago, she was climbing the career ladder at a marketing firm in the city with dreams of someday opening her own agency. That changed with one phone call. Her father, Colonel Robert Jennings, had been injured in Afghanistan. An IED explosion took his sight and left him with scars both visible and hidden. Amy still remembered rushing to the military hospital, seeing her strong, proud father, a man who had commanded respect throughout his 20-year military career, looking small in the hospital bed, bandages covering his eyes. "I can't see anything," he had whispered when she held his hand. "It's all darkness now." In the weeks that followed, Amy watched her father struggle not just with blindness, but with the crushing weight of PTSD. Night terrors would wake him screaming, reliving the moment when 3 of his men died in that explosion. During the day, he'd jump at sudden noises, his hands shaking as he tried to navigate a world he could no longer see. The decision to move back to her small hometown wasn't a difficult one. Her father needed her, and family always came first in the Jennings household. That's what her mother would have wanted before cancer took her 5 years earlier. Amy pulled her hair into a ponytail and glanced around her childhood bedroom. She had repainted it when she moved back in, covering the pink walls with a calming blue. Posters of bands she loved in high school had been replaced with framed photos from her college graduation and travels before her return. This room, like her life, had transformed into something different, not better or worse, just different. "Dad, you awake?" she called, knocking gently on his door before entering. Colonel Jennings sat on the edge of his bed, already dressed in ironed khaki pants and a button-up shirt. Even without his sight, he maintained the military precision that had defined his life. His white cane rested against the nightstand, and his fingers ran over the face of his watch, a special tactile timepiece that allowed him to tell time independently. "Tuesday, right?" he asked. "Hospital day." "That's right," Annie replied, helping him with his shoes. Dr. Lopez said they might try a new therapy approach today. Her father nodded, his face giving away nothing. He hated being dependent on anyone, even his daughter. In his mind, it should be the other way around, him taking care of her. Every Tuesday followed the same routine. Annie would drive them the 40 minutes to the VA hospital, her father sitting silently beside her, one hand resting on the door handle, the other clutching his cane. Sometimes they talked about simple things, the weather, news from around town, or stories from Amy's childhood. Other times, they drove in comfortable silence. After his therapy sessions, they would stop at Donna's Diner for lunch. It was their special tradition, a bright spot in what could otherwise be a difficult day. The owner, a woman whose own son had served in the army, always made sure they had the corner booth, quiet and away from the bustle of the main dining area. "You've got meatloaf today," Donna would say, not bothering with menus, "and apple pie for dessert. On the house for our hero." The colonel never corrected her about being a hero, and he knew he didn't feel like one. "The real heroes didn't come home," he told her once, his voice breaking. Life had fallen into this pattern. Therapy days, quiet evenings watching old westerns with audio descriptions, and Amy working remotely as a freelance writer while her father attended support groups for blind veterans. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but they made it work, day by day. What Amy never told her father was how she sometimes sat in her car during his appointments and cried, not from regret, but from the unfairness of it all. How a man who had given everything for his country now struggled to butter his own toast. How the neighborhood kids who once looked up to the strong military man now spoke in awkward whispers around him. But those tears were private. To her father, Amy remained strong, optimistic, and endlessly patient, because that's what he needed her to be. And somewhere along the way, she had become exactly that. Little did she know that the routine Tuesday they were about to face would change everything. The appointment at the VA hospital went longer than usual that Tuesday. Dr. Lopes had introduced Colonel Jennings to a new therapy technique for managing his PTSD symptoms. By the time they finished, it was already past 2 in the afternoon, and Amy could tell her father was tired. His shoulders slumped slightly, and the lines around his mouth had deepened, small signs that only a daughter would notice. "How about we stop at Donna's?" Amy suggested, guiding him carefully toward the parking lot. "I don't know about you, but I'm starving." Her father's face softened slightly. "Wouldn't mind some of that meatloaf," he admitted. The drive to the diner was quiet. Colonel Jennings rested his head against the window, his unseeing eyes closed. Amy wondered what was going through his mind. The therapy sessions often stirred up difficult memories, leaving him drained and withdrawn. Donna's Diner sat on the corner of Main and Oak, its neon sign flickering in the afternoon sun. It wasn't fancy, just a small-town diner with vinyl booths and formica tables, but it had the best comfort food for 50 miles. The bell above the door jingled as Amy held it open, her other hand gently guiding her father's elbow. "Well, look who's here," Donna called from behind the counter. She was a plump woman in her 60s with dyed red hair and a smile that took up half her face. "Your boot's waiting for you." Amy helped her father navigate between tables, his white cane sweeping carefully before each step. They had just settled into their corner booth when Donna appeared with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Meatloaf's extra good today," she said with a wink at Amy. "Made it with my secret ingredient." "Which is ketchup, not really a secret," Colonel Jennings said with a small smile, surprising both women. It was a glimpse of his old self, the quick-witted man who could light up a room with his humor. The diner was peaceful that afternoon. A couple of elderly men played chess by the window. A mother tried to convince her toddler to eat something green. Normal, everyday life happening around them. "The doctor thinks we should try group therapy," her father said suddenly, his fingers finding the silverware in front of him. He methodically aligned his fork and knife, a habit from his military days. "Says it might help to talk with others who understand." Amy reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "That sounds like a good idea, Dad." Their moment was interrupted by the roar of motorcycle engines. The sound grew louder until it cut off abruptly outside the diner. Amy glanced up to see 5 motorcycles parked haphazardly near the entrance. Her father tensed at the noise, his hand gripping his cane more tightly. "It's okay," she reassured him quietly. "Just some guys on bikes." The door burst open, and 5 men in leather jackets strode in. They were loud, laughing, and shoving each other playfully. Annie could smell the cigarette smoke clinging to their clothes from across the room. The peaceful atmosphere of the diner evaporated instantly. "Hey, Donna," the tallest one called out. 5 burgers, extra cheese, and whatever beer you've got cold." "You know I don't serve alcohol, Pete," Donna replied firmly. "But I'll get those burgers started." The men took over the largest booth, spreading out and talking loudly about their ride. Annie noticed her father's breathing had quickened slightly. Loud, unexpected noises often triggered his anxiety, a remnant of the explosion that took his sight. "We can go if you want," she offered quietly. Colonel Jennings shook his head. "I'm not going to run away from a little noise," he said, though his knuckles were white around his cane. Donna arrived with their food, placing the colonel's plate directly in front of him and describing the position of everything. Meatloaf at 6 o'clock, mashed potatoes at 9, green beans at 3. It was their routine, one that preserved his dignity by allowing him to eat independently. As they ate, Amy kept one eye on the bikers. Their voices grew louder with each passing minute, their stories more animated. One of them, a stocky man with a bushy beard, kept glancing over at them, his eyes lingering on the colonel's white cane. "Ready to head out?" Emmy asked when they'd finished eating. She could sense her father was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the noise. Colonel Jennings nodded, reaching for his wallet. "My treat today," he insisted, pulling out a crisp $20 bill. He had arranged his money methodically in his wallet, 1s, 5s, 10s, and 20s, each folded differently so he could identify them by touch. Emmy helped him up, placing his hand on her arm as they prepared to leave. They had almost reached the door when the group of bikers fell suddenly quiet. Emmy felt a chill run down her spine as she sensed their eyes on her father's careful movements. They were halfway to the door when it happened. The bearded biker stuck his heavy boot out just slightly into their path. It wasn't enough to cause a fall, but Colonel Jennings' cane caught on it, causing him to stumble forward. Annie quickly steadied him, her heart pounding. "Dad, you okay?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear, making it clear this was a veteran, a father, a human being worthy of respect. The bikers exchanged glances. And then the unthinkable happened. One of them snickered. Annie froze, her father's arm still in her grasp. The sound of that snicker seemed to echo in the suddenly silent diner. Donna stood behind the counter, coffee pot frozen mid-pour. The chess players by the window stopped mid-move. And something inside Annie, something that had been building for 3 long years of watching her hero father struggle, began to burn like a fuse lit at both ends. The snicker turned into a full laugh as the bearded biker nudged his buddy. "Looks like someone can't see where they're going," he said loudly. Annie felt her father stiffen beside her. His jaw clenched tight, but he said nothing, his military training kicking in. Stay calm under fire. "Come on, Dad," she said quietly, trying to guide him toward the door. But the tallest biker, the one Donna had called Pete, stepped into their path. He wore a leather vest covered in patches that had nothing to do with military service, just skull designs and crude phrases. His arms were covered in tattoos, and he smelled of cigarettes and engine grease. "Hold up there," Pete said, blocking their way. "Your old man nearly scuffed my boots." The diner had gone completely silent, and he could feel everyone watching, but no one moved to help. The mother with the toddler pulled her child closer. The chess players suddenly found their game incredibly interesting. "Please move," Amy said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. "My father is a veteran." Pete made an exaggerated stumbling motion, waving his hands in front of his face. "Oh no, I can't see," he mocked, drawing more laughter from his friends. "Maybe you should get him one of those funny vests, like a service dog." Colonel Jennings' grip tightened on his cane. "Emmy," he said quietly, "let's go." But the bikers weren't done. The bearded one joined in, walking with an exaggerated shuffle, tapping an imaginary cane. "Is this how you do it, old-timer?" Annie felt tears pricking her eyes, not from sadness but from fury. These men had no idea who they were mocking. They had no clue that her father had led troops into battle, had saved countless lives, had sacrificed his sight for people who would never even know his name. "He can't even defend himself," another biker chuckled, this one younger than the others, with a patchy attempt at a beard. "What kind of soldier are you anyway?" Something inside Emmy snapped. She stepped forward, placing herself between her father and the bikers. At 5'6", she barely reached their shoulders, but in that moment she felt 10 feet tall. "My father is Colonel Robert Jennings," she said, her voice cutting through the diner like a knife. "He commanded the 87th Infantry Division in Afghanistan. He lost his sight pulling 3 men out of a burning Humvee after an IED explosion." The younger biker's smile faltered slightly, but Pete doubled down. "Well, ain't that special?" he sneered. "Want a medal for that? Oh wait, you probably already got a bunch, right?" Behind the counter, Donna finally found her voice. "That's enough, Pete. You and your friends need to leave." Pete ignored her, leaning in closer to Emmy. "Your daddy's war is over, sweetheart. Nobody cares about that hero stuff anymore." Colonel Jennings suddenly moved forward, standing straighter, his military bearing returning in full force. Even without his sight, he had an air of command that made the bikers step back slightly. "Young man," he said, his voice calm but with an edge of steel, "you're right. My war is over. But I'd do it all again, lose mine eyes again, if it meant keeping people like you free to be exactly who you are, even if who you are is someone who mocks disabled veterans in diners." For a moment, shame flickered across Pete's face, but it was quickly replaced by defensiveness. "Whatever, man. We're just having some fun." "At the expense of a blind man," Donna said, coming around the counter with the phone in her hand. "I'm calling Sheriff Wilson if you don't leave right now." The bearded biker grabbed Pete's arm. "Come on, man, let's go. Food's probably trash anyway." The bikers shuffled toward the door, but not before Pete had one last parting shot. "See you around, Colonel," he said, emphasizing the title mockingly. "Or I guess you won't see me, will you?" They'd pushed past Amy and her father, laughing again as they headed outside. The roar of their motorcycles starting up filled the diner, then gradually faded as they rode away. The silence that followed was deafening. Amy helped her father to a nearby chair, noticing his hands were shaking slightly. Anger and humiliation fought for dominance on his face. "I'm so sorry about that," Donna said, rushing over with a glass of water. "Pete's always been trouble, ever since high school." "I'll call the sheriff anyway, report them." Colonel Jennings shook his head. Don't bother, it won't change anything. Emmy knelt beside her father's chair. Are you okay, Dad? He nodded stiffly, but she could see how the encounter had affected him. This proud man, who had once commanded hundreds of troops, had been reduced to a punchline for a group of ignorant bikers. The other diner patrons started talking again, trying to return to normal, but Amy noticed none of them had stood up for her father. They had just watched, uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved. Let's go home, Colonel Jennings said quietly. The drive home was silent, heavier than their usual comfortable quiet. Amy's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, her mind racing with all the things she wished she'd said, all the ways she wished she'd defended her father better. When they pulled into their driveway, her father spoke at last. It's okay, Amy, he said, his voice steadier now. I've heard worse. It's not okay, she replied, fighting back tears. It's not okay at all. This is the world we live in, he said with a sigh. People see the cane, the scars, and they forget there's a person behind them. A life, a story. They sat in the car, the engine ticking as it cooled down. Amy looked at her father's profile, still handsome, still proud, despite everything he'd been through. I need to make a phone call, she said suddenly, reaching for her phone. Inside the house, Amy helped her father to his favorite armchair. His movements were mechanical, his face still tight with the remains of humiliation. She made him tea, 2 sugars, no milk, the way he'd taken it since his army days. I'm going to step outside for a bit, she told him, placing the mug in his hands. On the front porch, Amy leaned against the railing and stared at her phone. Her thumb hovered over a contact she hadn't called in almost a year. She took a deep breath and pressed it. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. Tom Bailey. Tom, it's Amy. Amy Jennings. There was a pause, then warmth filled his voice. Well, I'll be. How's the Colonel doing? Amy swallowed hard. Not great, actually. That's why I'm calling. She paced the porch as she explained what had happened at the diner. Tom listened without interruption, but she could hear his breathing getting heavier as his anger built. Those sun's off. He caught himself. Sorry. But that ain't right, treating the Colonel that way. No, it's not, Amy agreed, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. But what can I do about it? It's not like I can fight them. Tom was quiet for a moment. Maybe you can't. But there are people who would stand up for the Colonel in a heartbeat. People who owe him their lives. A small spark of hope lit inside Amy. What do you mean? You remember I'm part of the Patriot Guard Riders now. How could she forget? Tom had been her father's driver during his last tour. He'd been the one who pulled the Colonel from the burning Humvee after the IED. He had escaped with just a few scars while her father lost his sight. The guilt had nearly destroyed Tom until he found purpose with the Patriot Guard, a motorcycle group composed of veterans who escorted military funerals and supported veterans' causes. I remember, she said. We protect funeral processions from those protesters, but that's not all we do, Tom explained. We look out for our own. Always. The Colonel was like a father to a lot of us over there. He saved more lives than you'll ever know. Emmy's mind raced. Those bikers come to Donna's every Tuesday and Thursday. That's their regular spot. Tuesday, you say? That gives us 6 days. There was a smile in Tom's voice now. How's the Colonel feel about reunions? For the first time since the incident, Amy felt a weight lift from her shoulders. I think a reunion is exactly what he needs. After ending the call, Amy sat on the porch steps, watching as fireflies began to dot the twilight. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tom. It's in motion. Tuesday, 1 p.m. Donna's. Spread the word to anyone who served with the Colonel. Amy scrolled through her contacts. There was Doug from her father's unit, who now lived just 2 towns over. And Lewis, who sent Christmas cards every year. And Kelly, the combat medic who'd written her father a letter each month during his recovery. One by one, she called them, explaining what had happened and what Tom was planning. Each call ended the same way, with an immediate, I'll be there. By the time she went back inside, her father had turned on the TV to a baseball game, the volume low. He couldn't see the game anymore, but he'd been a lifelong Yankees fan and still loved listening to the familiar sounds, the crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd. Everything okay? He asked as she sat in the chair beside him. He had always been attuned to her moods, even more so since losing his sight. "Just made some calls," she said casually. "Old friends. They might stop by soon." Colonel Jennings nodded, his face still tight, and he knew he was replaying the diner scene in his mind. For a man who had commanded respect his entire adult life, being mocked for his disability cut deeper than any physical wound. The next few days passed in their usual routine, but Amy could feel the tension in her father. He was quieter, his shoulders hunched slightly as if preparing for another blow. On Sunday, he asked her to take him to church, something he rarely did anymore. "Need some perspective," was all he said. She watched him sitting in the pew, head bowed, and wondered what he was praying for. Strength? Peace? The ability to forgive? On Monday night, Annie couldn't sleep. She kept checking her phone for updates from Tom. At midnight, he sent her a photo. A group of motorcycles lined up outside of VfB Hall, at least 30 of them, with the caption, "Just the advance team. More coming." Tuesday morning dawned bright and clear. Emmy made breakfast as usual, not mentioning anything about their plans for lunch. "Thought we'd go back to Donna's today," she said casually as she helped her father with his jacket. "Can't let those idiots chase us away from the best meatloaf in the county." Colonel Jennings hesitated. "I don't know, Emmy." "Dad," she said, taking his hand, "you taught me never to run from a fight. You taught me to stand tall, even when I'm scared. I watched you lead men into battle. I saw how they looked up to you." She squeezed his hand. "Let me take you to lunch, please." He sighed, then nodded once, his military bearing returning slightly. "All right. But at the first sign of trouble, we're leaving." Amby smiled, knowing trouble was the last thing they needed to worry about today. Deal. As they drove toward town, Amy's phone buzzed with texts. "Tom, in position. Doug, we're ready. Louise, it's a go." "Beautiful day," Colonel Jennings commented, his face turned toward the sun streaming through the passenger window. Amy looked at her father, at the silver in his dark hair, at the scars that traced patterns around his unseeing eyes, at the mouth that had so often smiled but had recently forgotten how. "Yes," she agreed, her heart pounding with anticipation. "I think it's going to be a very beautiful day indeed." As they approached Donna's diner, Amy noticed her father's hand tightening on his cane. His jaw was set in that determined way she'd seen countless times growing up, the look he wore before facing any challenge. "You sure about this?" he asked as she pulled into the parking lot. Annie glanced at her watch. 12:53 p.m. Perfect timing. "Absolutely sure, Dad." The parking lot was oddly empty for lunchtime. Emmy helped her father out of the car, noticing how he straightened his shoulders and raised his chin slightly. A soldier preparing for battle. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Inside, the diner seemed unusually quiet. Amy scanned the room quickly. There they were, Pete and his gang, lounging in the same booth as before, laughing over their burgers. When they spotted Amy and her father, Pete elbowed his bearded friend and smirked. "Well, look who's back for more," he called out. "Didn't learn your lesson last time, old man." Colonel Jennings didn't flinch. Amy led him to a booth on the opposite side of the diner, her heart hammering with anticipation. Donna appeared immediately, coffee pot in hand, a strange smile playing at her lips. "Good to see you both," she said, looking directly at Amy with a knowing glance. "Special today is meatloaf, as usual." "Sounds perfect," Annie replied. Pete's voice carried across the diner. "Hey, Blindman, need someone to cut your food for you? Or do you just stick your face in the plate like a dog?" His friends laughed, but it sounded hollow in the nearly empty diner. A couple at the counter shook their heads in disgust. Colonel Jennings sat perfectly still, his face betraying no emotion. "Just ignore them," he told Andy quietly. "Oh, I don't think we'll need to," she replied, just as the faint sound of motorcycle engines rumbled in the distance. The sound grew louder, swelling until it seemed to shake the windows of the small diner. Pete and his friends glanced outside, then at each other. "Sounds like a lot of bikes," the youngest one said nervously. The rumble became a roar as dozens of motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, filling it completely. Through the windows, Andy could see riders dismounting, men and women in leather vests covered with military patches, American flags, and unit insignias. Pete stood up, peering out the window. "What the hell?" The bell above the door jingled as the first rider entered. It was Tom, his imposing 6'4" frame filling the doorway. His leather vest bore the patches of the 87th Infantry and the Patriot Guard riders. The scar that ran down his left cheek seemed to pull his mouth into a permanent half-smile. "Colonel Jennings," he said loudly, crossing the diner in 3 long strides. He stopped before their table and snapped to attention, executing a perfect military salute. "Staff Sergeant Tom Bailey reporting, sir." Colonel Jennings' face transformed with recognition at the familiar voice. "Bailey, is that you?" "Yes, sir," Tom replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just me, sir." The door opened again, and more riders filed in. Doug entered, his prosthetic leg visible below his shorts, followed by Lewis with his burn-scarred arms. Kelly came next, her combat medic patch prominently displayed on her vest. One by one, they approached the table, each offering a crisp salute to their former commander. "What's happening?" Colonel Jennings asked Amy, confusion and wonder mixing in his voice. "Just a little reunion, Dad," she said, squeezing his hand. The bikers, Pete and his friends, sat frozen in their booth as the diner filled with veterans. Some wore prosthetics. Others bore visible scars. All carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of those who had served. Tom turned to face Pete's table, his expression hard. "You boys have a problem with Colonel Jennings." Pete swallowed visibly. "Look, man, we were just messing around. We didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Tom interrupted. "That he's a war hero. That he lost his sight pulling me and 2 others from a burning Humvee. That he's got more courage in his little finger than you've got in your entire body." The bearded biker stood up slowly. "We didn't mean any." "Sit down," Tom said quietly, but with such authority that the man immediately sank back into his seat. Lewis stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "The Colonel taught us that how you treat people, especially those facing challenges, says everything about your character." Kelly added, "He never left anyone behind. Not on the battlefield, not in the hospital, not ever." The diner had gone completely silent. Even Donna stood motionless behind the counter, tears streaming down her cheeks. Doug leaned on his prosthetic leg, looking directly at Pete. "I lost my leg the same day the Colonel lost his sight. Know what he did? He called me every single day during my recovery, from his own hospital bed, while dealing with his own darkness." Colonel Jennings' face softened at Doug's voice. "You made it through basic training with pneumonia, Douglas. I knew a missing leg wouldn't stop you." The veterans laughed, the warm, knowing laughter of shared experiences. By now, the diner was packed with former soldiers, all there for one purpose, to honor their colonel and to show these disrespectful bikers exactly who they had mocked. Tom turned back to Pete and his friends. "Now, I believe you owe the colonel an apology. A real one. And then I think it's time for you to find somewhere else to beat lunch." Pete stood up slowly, his earlier bravado completely gone. He approached Colonel Jennings' table, his eyes downcast. "Sir," he began awkwardly, "I want to apologize for how we treated you. We were way out of line. I'm sorry." Colonel Jennings tilted his head slightly, as if considering the apology. The diner held its collective breath, waiting for his response. "Apology accepted," he said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "Sometimes we all need a reminder about respect." Pete nodded, then motioned to his friends. They filed out silently, passing through the gauntlet of veterans who had come to stand by their commander one more time. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the diner broke. The veterans gathered around Colonel Jennings' table, pulling up chairs, sharing stories, reconnecting. Annie watched her father's face transform as he recognized voice after voice from his past. "You did this?" he asked Emmy during a brief lull, his voice choked with emotion. "All I did was make one phone call," she replied. "The rest was all them. All the lives you touched. All the people who never forgot you." For the first time in years, she saw her father's face light up with genuine joy. Here, surrounded by those who knew his true worth, the darkness that had haunted him since losing his sight seemed to lift, if only for a moment. And in that moment, Amy knew her one phone call had given her father something more valuable than revenge. It had given him back his dignity. The reunion at Donna's diner lasted well into the afternoon. Veterans squeezed into booths and pulled chairs from other tables, creating a makeshift gathering around Colonel Jennings. The sound of laughter and animated conversation filled the small restaurant. Donna kept the coffee flowing and eventually brought out trays of her famous apple pie on the house. "For our heroes," she said simply, her eyes still misty. Amy sat beside her father, watching his transformation with a full heart. His face had changed completely. The tight lines of stress had softened. He sat taller, his shoulders no longer hunched with the invisible weight he'd been carrying. Each time he recognized another voice from his past, his smile grew wider. "Lieutenant Rodriguez?" he would ask, head turning toward a new voice. "Is that really you?" "Last I heard you were stationed in Germany." "Changed my orders to come home after what happened to you, sir," came the reply. "Some commanders you follow anywhere, some you take a bullet for." Stories flowed around the table, tales of battlefield courage, of late-night card games in dusty tents, of the colonel's legendary stubbornness when fighting for better equipment for his troops. Amy heard stories about her father she'd never known, seeing him through the eyes of those whose lives he had touched. "Remember when the supply truck broke down 50 miles from base?" Tom asked, leaning forward on his elbows. "Colonel here wouldn't let us leave anything behind for the enemy. Had us load everything on our backs and walk through the night." Luz laughed. "My shoulders were bruised for weeks, but the colonel carried more than any of us." "Lead from the front," several veterans said in unison, clearly quoting one of her father's frequent sayings. Colonel Jennings shook his head, but Emmy could see the pride in his face. "You all exaggerate. I was just doing my job." "Your job?" Kelly reached across the table to touch his hand. "Sir, you wrote recommendation letters that got me into medical school. You sent care packages to my kids when I was deployed. That was never part of your job." One of the younger veterans, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "I was just a rookie when you lost your sight, Colonel. You probably don't even remember me. Private Reynolds. I was scared out of my mind on my first tour. You found me hiding during a firefight." The diner grew quiet as Reynolds continued. "I was sure you were going to report me, end my career before it started. Instead, you sat with me behind that wall for 5 minutes, talking me through my fear. You said being brave isn't about not feeling scared. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you're terrified." He paused, his voice cracking slightly. "I made it through 3 tours after that. Saved 4 of my buddies during an ambush. That was all because of you, sir." Colonel Jennings reached out, and Reynolds guided his hand to his shoulder. "I remember you, son. You were never a coward. Just young and human, like we all were once." Amy watched her father's face as he absorbed the impact of these stories, the ripple effect of his life that he could no longer see but could certainly feel in that moment. For 3 years he had been shrinking, becoming smaller in his darkness. Now, surrounded by evidence of his impact, he was expanding again, reclaiming his full stature. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread through the small town about the gathering of veterans at Donna's. People stopped on the sidewalk, peering through the windows at the collection of motorcycles filling the parking lot. Some took photos. Others simply stood in respectful silence. Inside, Tom clanked his coffee cup with a spoon, bringing the animated conversations to a halt. "Colonel, we didn't just come here to run off those disrespectful punks. We came because your daughter reminded us how much we owe you." Murmurs of agreement circled the room. "The Patriot Guard stands up for those who stood up for us," Tom continued. "And sir, no one stood up for his troops like you did." He reached into his leather vest and pulled out a patch, circular, with the emblem of the Patriot Guard riders. "We'd be honored if you'd accept this. You might not ride anymore, but you'll always have an escort when you need one." Colonel Jennings' hand trembled slightly as he accepted the patch, his fingers tracing the embroidered design. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't need to say anything, sir," Tom replied. "Just know that your army is still here, still ready to deploy when called." He looked meaningfully at Amy. "One phone call is all it takes." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the diner, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Eventually, some of the veterans had to leave, jobs to return to, families waiting at home. Each one approached the colonel before departing, some offering another salute, others clasping his hand or embracing him like a father. Doug was one of the last to leave. He clapped a hand on Colonel Jennings' shoulder. "Same time next month, sir?" First Tuesday. The VFW Hall has a pretty decent meatloaf too. Colonel Jennings nodded, his voice steady but full of emotion. I'd like that, Douglas. I'd like that very much. As the crowd thinned, Emmy noticed her father's energy beginning to flag. It had been an overwhelming day, filled with more emotion than he'd experienced in years. Ready to head home, Dad? She asked softly. He nodded, but there was a peace in his face she hadn't seen since before his injury. As Tom and the few remaining veterans helped him to his feet, Colonel Jennings turned toward where he knew Emmy was standing. You did good today, kiddo, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Your old man needed this more than he knew. Outside, the remaining motorcycles were lined up in formation, ready to provide an escort home. Tom helped Colonel Jennings into Emmy's car, then leaned in through the window. We'll be right behind you, he said. And Emmy? Don't wait a year to call next time. As they pulled out of the parking lot, the rumble of motorcycles fell in behind them, a guard of honor for a man who had spent his life protecting others. The sound filled the car, a powerful vibration that seemed to pulse through them both. Annie glanced at her father in the passenger seat. For the first time in 3 years, he looked truly alive, his head held high, a smile playing at his lips, his hand keeping rhythm on his knee to the rumble of the bikes. Thank you, he said quietly. Emmy smiled, keeping her eyes on the road as happy tears threatened to blur her vision. For what, Dad? For reminding me who I am. Sometimes, in the darkness, I forget. That's what family does, she replied. We remember for each other. 1 month later, Emmy pulled into the parking lot of the VFW Hall with her father beside her. The meeting had been marked on their calendar with a bold star, a new tradition to replace their old Tuesday routine at Donna's dinner. Sounds like we're not the first ones here, Colonel Jennings said, tilting his head toward the rumble of motorcycles already parked outside. Emmy smiled, not by a long shot. The doors to the VFW Hall opened as they approached, and Tom's booming voice called out, "The Colonel's here." Inside, at least 30 veterans stood at attention, snapping crisp salutes as Colonel Jennings entered. The past month had seen a remarkable change in her father. He stood taller now, his cane moving with more confidence. The Patriot Guard patch Tom had given him was pinned proudly to his jacket. But the biggest change was in his smile. It came easily now, no longer a rare guest on his face. At ease, for heaven's sake, the Colonel said, waving his hand. I'm retired, remember? Laughter filled the hall as the formal atmosphere dissolved into warm greetings. Annie watched as her father was surrounded once again by people who truly saw him not as a disabled man, but as the leader and hero he had always been. The monthly gatherings had been Tom's idea, but it was Doug who had expanded it into something more. Along with the social aspect, they had created a support network for veterans in the area, particularly those struggling with physical disabilities or PTSD. Colonel Jennings had become an inadvertent mentor to many of them. Colonel, I'd like you to meet someone, Doug said, guiding a young man forward. This is Jack, just got back from his 3rd tour. Lost his sight in an IED explosion 2 months ago. Annie watched her father's expression shift into one of deep understanding. He extended his hand precisely in Jack's direction, an instinct developed from years of command. Good to meet you, son, he said. Tough road ahead, but you're not walking it alone. Jack's face, tense with the effort of navigating a new environment without sight, relaxed slightly. They told me you might understand better than most, sir. Pull up a chair, Colonel Jennings said. First thing you should know is that the darkness isn't your enemy. It's just a new battlefield. And like any battlefield, you need the right strategy. As her father began sharing his hard-won wisdom with the young veteran, Amy slipped away to help Kelly set up the coffee station. The women's area of the hall had grown over the past month as more female veterans and military families joined their group. Your dad's a natural at this, Kelly remarked, nodding toward where the Colonel sat with Jack and 2 other disabled vets. He's helped more people in a month than most of the official programs do in a year. Amy nodded, her chest tight with pride. It's helped him too. He's sleeping better. The nightmares aren't as frequent. From across the room, Lewis called for everyone's attention. Before we start lunch, I've got a little announcement to make. The hall quieted as Lewis made his way to the front, a piece of paper in his hand. Some of you might have heard about those bikers who were hassling the Colonel and Amy at Donna's last month. Murmurs of disapproval rumbled through the crowd. Well, I ran into their leader, Pete, at the gas station yesterday. Louis paused, looking around the room. He asked if he could give me something to bring here today. Louis unfolded the paper. It's a letter. He asked if he could read it to the group, but I told him that wasn't a good idea right now. So I'll read it instead, if that's okay with the Colonel. Colonel Jennings nodded, curious. Louis cleared his throat. To Colonel Jennings and everyone at the VFW, he read. I've been trying to find the right words for weeks now. What my friends and I did was wrong. Disrespectful. Unforgivable, really. The hall was completely silent now, everyone listening intently. Seeing all those veterans stand up for you that day, it hit me hard. Made me think about my own grandfather who served in Vietnam. How I'd feel if someone treated him that way. I've been ashamed ever since. Amy glanced at her father, whose face remained impassive as he listened. I wanted you to know that I've been volunteering at the VA hospital for the past 3 weeks, helping with the transportation program for disabled vets. It's not much, but it's a start at being a better person. I hope someday I might earn enough respect to shake your hand properly. Louis folded the paper. It's signed Pete Wilson. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Colonel Jennings cleared his throat. Next time you see him, tell him he's welcome to join us here. Everyone deserves a second chance. The whole burst into conversation, some agreeing with the Colonel's forgiveness, others more hesitant. Annie watched her father, marveling at his capacity for grace after everything he'd been through. Later, as they sat eating lunch, Tom leaned over to Amy. You know, when you called me that day, I was just thinking about teaching those punks a lesson. I never imagined all this would come from it. Amy looked around the hall. At the veterans finding healing together, at Jack learning from her father's experience, at the new friendships forming across generational lines. Even at Pete's letter, a small ripple of change in their community. That's the thing about standing up for what's right, she said. You never know how far the ripples will spread. Tom raised his coffee mug. To ripples, he said with a grin. To ripples, Amy agreed, tapping her mug against his. Across the table, her father was deep in conversation with Jack, demonstrating how he organized his wallet by folding different bills in specific ways. His hands moved with confidence, his face animated as he shared his hard-won knowledge. 3 years ago, a roadside bomb had taken Colonel Jennings' sight and nearly his spirit. A month ago, the mockery of strangers had almost broken what remained of his pride. But today, surrounded by his true family, the one formed not by blood but by shared sacrifice and respect, he was whole again. Amy watched as her father laughed at something Jack said, the sound rich and genuine. The shadows that had haunted him for so long seemed lighter now, pushed back by the light of purpose and community. One phone call. That's all it had taken to remind the Colonel, and perhaps the whole town, that true respect isn't demanded. It's earned. And once earned, it remains, an invisible medal more valuable than any that could be pinned to a uniform.